The flood of '93 put millions of acres underwater and broke more than 1,000 levees. But one levee stands out. A jury convicted James Scott in 1994 for intentionally breaking the West Quincy levee and unleashing a flood previously held back. But to this day, Scott says he did not do it.
I've spent over half my life in prison for something I haven't done.
James Scott is convicted of causing the failure of the West Quincy levee in 1993. This month, Scott told KOMU in the days leading up to the failure he'd been volunteering along the levee.
If I can kind of, do good, that people may forget about some of the stuff that I've done in my past.
When it broke on July 16th, Scott was grabbed by a local reporter for an interview. From that point forward, Scott was the #1 suspect, according to Quincy Police Sergeant Neil Baker.
Jimmy Scott looked like a deer caught in the headlights. He was very excited, and I've always felt like half of him wanted to shout to the world what he had done, and half of him wanted to get the heck out of there because he knew the enormity of what he had done.
Baker and Scott have history. Baker had put Scott behind bars about 5 years before the levee broke for arson.
Arson is by nature a lifetime criminal.
An investigation began and Scott was put on trial in 1994. After 4 weeks, he was sentenced to 20 years to life in Jefferson City Correctional Center. He had a retrial in 1998 with the same result. But in '98, Scott had David Hammer, a soil scientist, as his chief witness.
I reviewed what he had, a little bit of it, and decided that he had a beyond reasonable case here, that I didn't see how one person could have broken this levee.
Hammer, to this day, is adamant that Scott did not break the West Quincy levee.
I don't know how somebody under those conditions, as sloppy as things were and as moist as everything was, could have done that and outrun the flood that breached the levee.
Hammer said there were 6 conditions that were identified as increasing the likelihood of a levee failure.
All 6 existed at that exact spot. That's part one. Part two is that this was the 12th levee break in 11 days. The levees were failing in sequence, just like dominoes falling.
He said it wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when this levee was going to fail. Hammer thinks the reason Scott is behind bars now is simple. He was a scapegoat.
And I think this was a travesty of justice. That, in fact, has given the state of Missouri a black eye across the country.
Baker is on the opposite end of the spectrum. There is not a doubt in his mind that Scott broke that levee.
I do believe very firmly that he did it, and that taking 4 or 5 sandbags from a depressed area of the levee on July 16th of 1993 sure could have caused that levee break.
Baker doesn't even believe Scott was helping out on the levee.
I think he's lying to you and maybe to himself. But no, he didn't go over there and do that. He went over and break the levee, nor had he been working on the levee.
Baker has heard different people talk over the years about corrupt officers in Scott's conviction. He denies the claims.
And I never went out with blinders on looking for one guy to pin. I never wanted to pin anything on anybody.
Scott, who's a few years away from a parole hearing, still holds on to hope.
One day, hopefully soon, that I'll be released to go home. Like I said, this ain't home, prison's not home.
But for now, he waits in the same place he's called home for the past 25 years. James Scott is up for parole in 2023, but as far as a new look at his trial, Hammer says all the evidence has been lost. In the studio, Eric Graves, KOMU 8 News.